the types of people who are here. We have sort of a specialist who can go broad, and we also have a generalist who can go deep. And I think in my experience in Aspen, those have tended to be some of the most interesting conversations because you can cover so much ground. So I'll introduce him. David Rothkopf is the CEO of the Foreign Policy Group, obviously a media company known for producing Foreign Policy magazine, but they do a bunch of other things.
That's true. I left there 3 weeks ago.
Oh, did you really? Well, he was the former CEO of
I
the Foreign
have a lot of other jobs.
Policy Group. Well, why don't you tell us? Yeah, tell us. What are you working on now?
No, I have a company that, is a media company, an advisory company, and I'm teaching at Columbia, and I run a program at Carnegie Endowment.
And you have a book that is called?
I have a book called something, Great Questions of Tomorrow.
Yes, with TED Books.
TED Books, and a podcast called Deep State Radio.
Awesome. Well, Heather, I'll introduce you. You have a lot of titles, so I want to make sure. Heather Roff is a senior research fellow at Oxford. She's a cybersecurity fellow at New America and a research scientist at Arizona State. She's also working on some projects for Google's DeepMind about the ethics of AI. So today we're going to talk about killer robots, obviously, autonomous war systems that can make some subset of decisions on their own. And what I hope you really get from it is kind of a quick scan of the state of the art of these weapon systems, some of which are been deployed in some ways, as well as to kind of look at the philosophical and moral underpinnings of how to understand these kinds of systems. But, it's Friday, it's an intimate group, and I want you to get to know these people who you're going to spend an hour of your Aspen experience with. And so I'm actually going to ask them both about a job that they had long ago. So David, let's start with you. In 1973, you had a summer job at Bell Labs, one of the coolest places. How did you find yourself there, and how did your summer shape your life?
Well, actually, my dad was a scientist at Bell Labs, and I worked at Bell Labs for the first 4 jobs I ever had, which were summer jobs successively. And the first one was terrible because they put me into a room which was occupied by the inventor of the artificial larynx.
This is like if you like smoke cigarettes.
The thing you hold up to your neck,
right.
But the room was just filled with dead larynxes, right? So like all the walls in the room were jars with, not just larynxes, but badly cancer-afflicted larynxes.
Oh my God!
And I was like, "You sitting here for the summer?"
Were they trolling your dad? You think? Like, what do you think that was?
I don't know. He may have been trolling me. But in any event, work at Bell Labs really sort of got me started in a direction which is a little unusual for somebody who is a national security foreign policy specialist. Although as it's happened, the longer I do it, the more valuable all of this is, and that is having a heavy focus on technology from the beginning. And almost every job that I've been involved in has had a heavy focus on technology, and I've written books and articles on technology. And I founded a company at one point that did open source intelligence for the intelligence community. We had this idea that you could search the internet. This was like a week before Google. And it was really brilliant timing on our part. I did it with John Deutsch, who had run the CIA, and Tony Lake, who run the NSC. And we had a junior staffer there, I'm kidding a little bit, named Susan Rice, who later ran the NSC, and a bunch of other folks like that. And we thought we could go to any organization and say, we can answer any question that you've got by searching the internet. And that was true, but the thing that we learned was nobody knew what questions to ask, which is actually one of the things that led to the book that I've just done, which is called Great Questions, which is about the issue of asking questions, but it's also about the core issue here. And that is that we're in the midst of, we're used to technological change, but we're in the midst of not just an acceleration, but a broadening of the areas in where technological change is going to take place. Warfare is one of them. Economics is one of them. What is money will change. What is a job will change. What is a government will change. What is a democracy will change. Literally every aspect of how we organize society will change. And yet what strikes me is there's very, very little discussion about the philosophical underpinnings of this.
Yeah.
Like, why are we going to change, and to what purpose, and what metrics are we going to use, and are these changes necessarily good? And the problem is compounded by the fact that the speed of change is something that we've never dealt with. And you know, I often summarize this by saying, you know, it took us 350 years to get from Gutenberg to the First Amendment to the US Constitution. It also took those 350 years to get from book 1 to book number 100 million. It took 70 years to get from telephone 1 to telephone number 100 million. And it took 33 days to get from Angry Birds 1 to 100 million examples of Angry Birds out there. And that just means that, you know, all these things are happening. And there will be autonomous drones in the battlefield, or swarms of autonomous, you know, craft in the air over a battlefield long before we've had a thoughtful society-wide discussion about the philosophical underpinnings of that question.
And we're gonna come into that. Heather, I want to ask you about a job that you unwisely told me about yesterday, which was that you were a dolphin trainer, but you were a war dolphin trainer. And I actually think this is quite relevant to the discussion.
Combat dolphins?
Combat dolphins, yeah. Which is a real thing. It's not a joke. It is a real thing. But it actually gets at something really interesting, which is other ways of thinking about working with non-human intelligence within war. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that experience, just because it's awesome, and how it influences the work that you do now.
Yeah, so long ago, I'm not going to say when because then I'll date myself, I worked for the U.S. Navy Marine Mammal Program, training dolphins and sea lions and a beluga whale, the muktuk, which if you don't know what muktuk means in Inuit, it is whale meat. Because, you know, we love to name our dolphins well. Yeah, so I trained them to do mine countermeasures, so finding sea mines underwater so that you can have safe passage of ships, as well as diver detection and basically detainment. So yeah, so we...
That means beating up people. The dolphins would beat the people up.
Are you serious? Really?
This is a very sensitive topic for the U.S. Navy, and if I am going to not anger PETA and all sorts of other institutes, I would...
It's sensitive because the Navy doesn't like the idea that their divers could be beat up by a dolphin.
Well, no, it's just that the dolphins are treated very well, and we don't force them
War
to.
animals,
Yeah,
right.
they're war animals. But that job really opened up a different world for me because I am a political scientist by training, and I was studying political science and IR and all this stuff at the time, and I applied for this job, and I totally BS'd my way in. And it was amazing that I did. And I got there, and they're like, oh, are you working for, you know, all these other animal husbandry groups and this and that? And these women had these amazing internships on these other places at Disney and SeaWorld. And I was like, nope, I'm a political science major at U of A. And they're like, why are you here? I was like, because I'm interested in defense. It was just totally nonsense. I just wanted to like play with dolphins. So, but it was a really great experience. But it did, you know, at the time, I didn't really realize what it was going to kind of ingrain and open in my mind. And now when I study AI and technology and how we orient ourselves to technology, I really draw on that experience because you do have such highly intelligent animals they don't speak your language. You communicate through some sort of shared language, you know, hand signals or something like this. But they're highly, highly intelligent, and they have just a different way of seeing the world. Like, I'm never going to understand what a biosonar looks like to a dolphin, right? I can't see that way. And I think AI and weapons aren't going to see the same way that I see. So, but that doesn't mean that I can't figure out ways to communicate and to learn and to interact with those systems. And so I think that's a good heuristic to think about them as kind of alien intelligences, akin to something like animals. And that way, you know, you're not expecting too much, but you're also not projecting too much of yourself on them as well.
Yeah. David, how did you come to get interested specifically in sort of autonomous weapons?
Well, you know, I do national security. I've done national security. I've written a bunch of books about national security, and I've been struck by the degree to which the national security discussion has moved forward into, sort of first adding precision and then adding smartness and then adding autonomousness to weapon systems. And, first of all, it's kind of cool. It was interesting, it's Killer Robot, Terminator, and all that kind of stuff. But the thing that, got me the most was it raised an interesting philosophical question, which is, do technologically endowed nations have the prospect of waging wars against less technologically endowed nations, where the less technologically endowed nations put human beings, flesh and blood, at risk, and the technologically endowed nations do not? And, it's not abstract, right? I mean, if you were in Pakistan or Afghanistan or Yemen or someplace and, you knew somebody who was blown up by a drone, it doesn't really matter to the victim whether the drone was guided by a guy in a container in Arizona or whether it had its own autonomous intelligence. What the victim is struck by, or what the families of the victim is struck by, is that these Americans who are operating these drones are far away, safe, and they go home and they have dinner, but they have these predators that are literally
the name of the drone.
The name of the drone that are preying on these people without human risk being involved in the calculation. And so to me, it changes the nature of conflict in a way that, and that's just one of them. I mean, we can get into others later, but that was the first one that kind of drew me in. The other thing that drew me in about it was, it's a comment I quoted yesterday in a talk I gave yesterday morning, so if anybody was there, forgive me. But in the 50s, when people went into national security, they had to learn to speak nuclear. They had to be trained, they had to speak throw wave, they had to know those things. It was gating, you couldn't get in. And in fact, still today in the US government, there's a hierarchy, and the people who are able to speak that language are sort of at the highest level. They're the sort of alpha national security types. And that's the way the whole system is built. But now we're moving into a world in which cyber and AI and these other things are really the critical issues. And there's almost nobody who understands them.
I do, it's okay.
Fortunately, we have one person who understands. And she is benevolent and will not abuse this, I'm sure.
I've been talking to the Air Force. I'm trying to walk them down.
But I had this conversation with Mike Hayden, who ran a big chunk of the intelligence community, and he said he used to go into the White House and he would brief them, and they would look at him like he was a Rain Man, because they just didn't understand. And so to me, another element of this is the leadership challenge that's posed by very rapid technological change, where we're not at an equivalent or sufficient speed upgrading the quality of our leadership to be able to deal with those issues.
Yeah. I know you could speak to that very directly, but let's start with how you, just so we kind of get everyone the same foundation, how do you define autonomous weapon systems, and how do you kind of break them up into their behaviors to understand them better?
Yeah, so I mean, let me preface this by saying that there is a huge debate going on right now in Geneva at the United Nations about what exactly a definition of autonomous weapon systems is and how it differs from presently automated systems. And when the automation turns to autonomy, is it a sliding scale or is it discrete groups and all these things?
I think we've seen it in self-driving cars too, right? Like there's
levels.
People
there's
have
like
agreed
5,
that there's 5 levels of
right.
self-driving cars, with down here being like cruise control and up here being
like totally.
There's not even a steering wheel.
So I'm gonna just punt to the DoD's definition, which I have some issues with. I've written about some of those issues with their definitions, but basically it's a weapon system once activated that can select and engage targets without intervention of a human operator. Now what that really means, I think, is the crucial word there is selection. Because we have systems that engage automatically all the time, right? Missile defense systems, the Israeli Iron Dome, all of these types of close-in weapons systems, phalanx, counter-rocket mortar systems. Those engage automatically all the time. So the crucial thing is the selection bit and how you select a target and when and where that selection occurs. And so in our last session, we talked a lot about data and the data of a trained AI system. The question that the DoD doesn't really answer very clearly for me is if I have selected particular images or targets and put them in a library, target library, does that mean that a human has selected those targets and that the system, once deployed, and can be deployed for months or even a year, isn't really autonomous because a human has selected some set of parameters, search parameters, and target objects? And they don't really want to say anything about that. Or is it that in that moment before engagement, it is selecting something out of a target acquisition basket or something? And if it's the latter, well, then we have a lot of systems already in play that look like that. If it's the former, then I'm not quite certain that this notion of autonomous systems is ever going to get resolved, because you would have to say, well, then the system has to generate its own targets, which, of course, I don't know any modern military in the world that would be okay with that. So there's a fuzziness about this notion of selection in terms of time and distance and quality.
And that's why one thing you hear when you start to look into this literature is that we should keep a human in the loop.
Yeah.
Right? People say this. Have you heard this too? Like, keep a human in the loop.
On the loop, in the loop, out of the loop.
Yeah, and I guess the question is sort of what is a...
So you mean like the commander-in-chief is always there and you know he's got a steady hand?
Yeah, I guess, right?
Well, it actually does
okay,
get...
maybe that's a terrible example.
No, but actually, it's actually not too far off, given that it's probably a man.
Yeah.
So let's just put that one out there.
Well, I meant one in particular.
Oh, yeah, well, small hands.
There's a tiny
There's a
tiny hand on the
there's
joystick.
a tiny hand on the button.
Yeah, right.
Sorry, I shouldn't say that. But
Sorry. I'm sorry.
you got me into this trouble. No, but I think that there is this idea about the loop that I think is actually quite troubling, right? Because you can again talk about it very narrowly, right?
But what is the loop? The loop
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. So you could say something like, "Oh, there's a decision, and you need to have there's a." You can think of it as the OODA loop, which is orient, observe, decide, and act. And I think that's kind of what they mean. So like when we're doing orient, observe, decide, and act, we can say we can automate.
Which normally would have been a person.
Yeah, or you could automate, the orient and the observe part. So this is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and maybe a little analysis. And then you would say, okay, now I'm going to push that information to a commander, and they're going to do the decide and the act bit. That's increasingly getting encroached upon. So it might be just as simple as like, I push the button to fire. That would be the human in the loop. But that is getting, again, like I said, pressed upon. So like the Dutch government, for instance, wants to talk about meaningful human control in the wider loop, which is the command and control loop, which again, if you say, well, there's a human somewhere, a human had to build it, a commander had to launch it, there's a human in the wider loop. And you're like, well, that starts to just press against common sense about what we're talking about. So that I think gets a little politicking and dangerous to be like,
right, because the
where's
equivalent
the
would
loop?
be like if there's no steering wheel in a car, but Google built the car.
And there's
then the
engineers
human
at
was in the
Google.
loop.
I mean, Google has people in the building,
But
so
also,
clearly.
it's in some ways these are distinctions without a difference, right?
Yeah.
Because in the cockpit of
F-35.
or a Airbus 380, it's all automated, and you could go from takeoff to landing without the pilot doing anything, and the pilot is there to exert some control, but there's a reverse thing that happens, which is the pilot won't do anything without the feedback and the approval of the system.
Yeah, it's an automation bias.
And so there's a loop within the loop.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things about autonomous weapon systems or killer robots, if you want to talk about it that way, is we're not talking about like humanoid sentient terminators that are going to come get you. And so I think talking about it in those terms is just unhelpful.
Yeah.
It doesn't address the technologies that we have today that are coming online in the next 5 to 10 years. that are that are quite intelligent on what they want to find. You know, it might be a particular acoustic signature of a submarine, or it might be using deep learning and neural nets using synthetic aperture radar pictures to do automatic target recognition. Those are the things that are happening right now, and it has nothing to do with sentience, and it has nothing to do with the Terminator, and it has nothing to do with superintelligence and any of those things. These weapon systems are coming, and it's a question of what you want to do and how much control you want to give over to them.
And those are all the kinetic systems.
Yeah, we're not even talking about the non-kinetic, I mean, because cyber,
Right,
well, in
so-
Geneva
Yeah,
you
for those who
can't
aren't
talk about
familiar,
it.
in the military world, cyber is sort of over here, and then things that blow up
Things that go boom are over here.
are over here, and they call it kinetic for
Right.
some reason.
But again,
Physics.
that's the power plant, which might have been the target, runs on a software package, which might be a better target. And the military planner has the choice of, I'm going to go in after the software package, or I'm going to go after the hard target.
Right.
And there's often a lot of benefits to going in after the software package. It's stealthier.
Yeah, I
you
mean,
get-
I should say that in the US case, our policies on autonomous weapon systems do not apply to cyber weapons. So all restrictions on who you need to do what in the acquisition cycles for those systems and what kinds of targets they can go after are only applying to kinetic systems. The DoD has carved out an exception for cyber.
Right. So you have restrictions in terms of blowing up the building, but fewer restrictions in terms of what makes the things inside the building work.
Right.
Well, degrading versus blowing up also, I think, in the laws of war have a slightly different view too.
Well, historically they have, but I mean, we're also, one of the things that we've seen is we've gone from the Cold War mentality, where it was about destruction, and in fact, where the price of conflict became so high we didn't dare enter it, to the Cool War scenario, where essentially the price of conflict is so low that you don't dare stop. And so you might have conflicts. In fact, we're very likely in the future to have many more conflicts where the goal is degrading. The goal is not to kill the enemy, it's to give them a low-grade infection, or to slow down a part of the economy, or to weaken their capability to do something with regard to a neighbor, and it's not to destroy them. And this is a continuum of choices that we've got, but we've got some lines in the continuum that are a little illogical at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm a little more skeptical on that. I mean, I do think that if we want to just look at non-kinetic forms of attack and attack vectors as weakening, that's one way to do it. Same thing with propaganda and information and all this stuff. But there is afoot right now, I think, a really strong movement to create more and more technology to offset adversarial capabilities. And so if that's true, then if I want to pursue artificial intelligence and robotics to be able to engage in suppression of enemy air defense exercises against my near-peer adversary, i.e. China or Russia, then what are they going to do in response? It's cyclical, right? If I invent, they invent. I invent, they invent. And so in that sense, we're moving into a very odd and dangerous space that is unlike the Cold War, because we're talking about conventional weapons. We're not talking about nuclear weapons. But I don't think that it's just going to be us engaging in kind of gray wars or measured short of war to get our foreign policy objectives across. I think we're going to
different scenarios.
They're totally
right?
different
I mean, they could
scenarios.
be-
Exactly.
Yeah, and I don't think it's going to be just that either. I think
Okay.
there's this continuum,
Yeah.
and all I was saying is that it's interesting that we're coming up with rules for part of it and not for other parts of it, and yet having a certain degree of autonomy and systems in the cyber side is a different.
Or just to step back a tiny bit, what are the international norms and principles that people should be sort of keep in mind when they're thinking about this continuum and they're thinking about individual autonomous weapon systems?
I mean, well, first off, so international law, the international humanitarian law, the law of war, regulates the behavior of combatants, right? We're seeing some movement now about, the crime of aggression, which is a different set of kind of use ad bellum, so justice before war considerations. Use in bello or justice in war considerations regulate proportionality, distinction, in necessity. So, am I hitting the right person? Is it permissible for me to attack that person? Are you a civilian or are you a combatant? That's discrimination. Is it proportionate? Is the force I'm using the right amount of force in relation to the military objective sought? And is it necessary? Am I using the least amount of force possible? Those are like the three kind of big ones in international law. That's the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols 1 and 2. Or as they like to say in Geneva, protocols additional 1 and 2. And so I think when you're looking at those, that's the most kind of nitty-gritty about what are we talking about with these systems. Can they engage in a proportionality calculation? A proportionality calculation is done usually at command side, right, and with lawyers involved. And they say, what is this particular military objective? What is it worth? And what's the collateral damage that's going to happen? How much blood am I willing to take to get that objective? If there is no collateral damage, there is no proportionality calculation being done. So you have to know going in that there's going to be some sort of calculation. So now the question is, can we automate that? Well, what are our metrics? And how am I operationalizing this particular military objective? And then how am I valuing bodies or lives or lethal or those types of things? And then if I write this program, like, what does that do to the kind of command responsibility of if something goes wrong, accountability mechanisms? There's all sorts of, also just there's kind of a weird like, this machine is engaging in a proportionality calculation, even if it can, should it?
Yeah.
And also we have some recent experience, and not to mention all of human history, but recent experience that will illustrate to us that in different circumstances, we tend to bend the law, to suit ourselves. And you could say, the invasion of Iraq was a particularly good example of this, and I think it illustrates something important, which is that when you get into a highly emotionally fraught political setting, then people start to say, well, we're going to set aside some of these calculations in terms of collateral damage or other kinds of things.
I don't know if they set it aside. It's just that the objective becomes more important, so they're willing to take more risk.
Well, the objective may be perceived to be more important,
right.
and the result is, if you have 800,000 civilian deaths in a
right.
country, as you do in Iraq as a result of one element of the war or not, that suggests that either we set aside the standards that we thought it was really, really important. As it turned out, it wasn't really, really important. So that illustrates that problem. But the other thing is that even super highly litigiously minded administrations, and there's never been one more than the Obama administration, with more lawyers looking at more things at more times, go, well, this issue of sovereignty, there are there are legal issues here beyond the military law issues. This issue of sovereignty is a little blurry, and it's okay to violate sovereignty with a drone in a way that we wouldn't want to violate sovereignty with a helicopter full of soldiers. And so we bend things a little bit, and we tend to bend them in direct proportion to how detectable they are and what the downside risk is to us. And so, you could have swarms of very, very small drones.
They're called darts.
Darts.
They're about this big.
Right.
They fit in the palm of your hand, and we have smaller ones called flies that go on your finger.
And they can go in undetected, do a whole bunch of things, get out undetected, and when you can do it undetected, then you tend to start saying, well,
It changes the calculation.
rules don't apply, because the rules only apply if you can get caught.
Yeah. And also, something I've heard from you a couple times is the way that the drone war has been sort of a pattern for what we might see with autonomous systems, both in sort of how it's received in countries that have been on the receiving end of the violence, as well as sort of in our decision-making apparatus. Do we see that in the literature too, in the sort of social science literature that's being produced around?
Yeah, I think you do. One thing to keep in mind is my personal pet peeve with just the word drone, because drone.
So it implies, yeah.
It implies,
everyone knows what drone.
Yeah, and it always implies like a predator or a reaper with like hellfires on it, right? When in fact, right, what we have is thousands of different kinds of unmanned systems that are in the land, the sea, and the air. And so in that sense, right, you could have a DART drone, a DART system that's going to be this big. It's not going to carry payload, right? It's just for intelligence and surveillance. Maybe if you really want to be nasty, you could have a small charge on it, or maybe a bioweapon, and you could use it for assassination. Yes, I put my evil genius hat on occasionally.
It frankly looked like you were enjoying that.
No. I think about it only in terms of okay, if I think of this, guess what? Someone else is going to think of it. And so then what are the countermeasures that I need to think about to address that? But yeah, the Predator and the Reaper programs in Afghanistan and in Pakistan really, I think, brought attention, the public eye, to this. And so when the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, led by Human Rights Watch, came out, I think that was actually why they got so much traction, was because there was a public there was something you could see, right? It wasn't vaporware. It wasn't there's this thing out there and it's a boogeyman I don't understand. Actually, we have this Predator and this Reaper engaging in these very, very long standoff missions. Even though there's a human pilot and there's a whole command system behind that, people didn't really see that that's how it was. It was just a longer standoff weapon that had persistence, long persistence. So I think in that sense, it allowed the public imagination to kind of grapple with autonomous weapon systems, and then also people consistently interchange them. In fact, in the UN, in the Convention on Conventional Weapons meeting, Pakistan consistently talks about drones rather than autonomous weapon systems. And it's yes, we know, but we're talking about this other thing right now. But that gets slippage a lot as well.
David, I was going to ask you about the sort of development of these technologies sort of in a global sense, right? I mean, I feel like in your previous job and probably in your new one, we'll deal in sort of global terms. I mean, one of the things that seems hard in this debate is that even if we have it here, these technologies are going to be developed elsewhere.
And they're proliferate as well.
Yeah, it seems pretty clear now that on basic fundamentals of AI, China's going to be pretty good. At the very least, one other country,
The Israelis think they're
The Israelis think they're pretty
Israelis,
good.
yeah.
Fair enough.
On unmanned systems, the Israelis are really good.
Yeah, the Israelis think they're actually best on unmanned systems.
Yeah, they're rocking and
So
rolling.
2, at least, and we could probably keep widening the circle for various things. So how should we think about that?
Well, I think, we tend to refer to the arms race as if it were a thing that took place at one time. But there was always an arms race, and there's always been an arms race. And, feudal lord X got gunpowder, and feudal lord Y said, I better get some gunpowder, and this goes on. And I think when you look at the costs of war, so many of the costs are human, and so many of the political costs are human, that the more you can get human beings out of war, the more the cost-benefit analysis of going into war looks better. And so there is a very, very high temptation for certain nations, and by the way, particularly for smaller nations, who, it used to be the unit. You still today, if you say, who is the biggest army, you're going to get the Chinese have 1.x million, whatever,
right.
And that was the unit of measure of the size of your force.
Right.
But if you move into this world,
It's capability.
and you could have a country of, just like this crowded room, but if we had the capital and the technological resources, we could be as powerful as some other. And so you get into a new kind of asymmetry from the kind that we've been discussing for the past 20 years.
It's also really hard to measure, right? So thinking about, David, you had said something about the Cold War, right? And if we're talking about, this linear thinking about progress in this way and then gaps between them, right? I can count X many warheads. I cannot count your capability in AI or in cyber security or in these other things. I can guess about it. I can do some intelligence reconnaissance work. I can maybe get some human intelligence sources, but I don't really have a good handle on it. I've got a good general handle on it, but not a specific one like counting warheads. And I think that is going to make deterrence as well as bargaining more difficult when you're saying, I got this big thing, but...
Yeah, and there's a big point here to flag, right? The point is, 500 years ago, you went off into war and your leaders led the army that went off into war, and you killed each other at the end of a 3-foot or 2-foot long blade, and you watched the other side die. People hacked each other to death and died of infection afterwards.
I think we got that picture.
Okay.
He was enjoying it.
Yeah, you're enjoying it like my
You got
assassination.
your moment.
Yeah.
I was getting caught up in that. But you can watch Game of Thrones.
Yeah, right.
But the point is, one of the big risks of this is the degree to which it makes war look low cost, feasible, tolerable, politically tolerable.
Well, especially if it's covert. I mean, if it's covert, you don't even see it, right? I mean, this is.
So I guess do we just ban autonomous weapon systems? I mean, is it possible? Do we just say, because what you're saying earlier about how hard it is to detect makes the verifiability of a ban very difficult. But do we do it anyway, just sort of as a statement of principle?
So, I mean, I think there's a couple different things that need to happen. One is that the negotiations in Geneva over the last several years, while moving quickly in Genevan terms and UN terms, are just going so slow that the technology and the development and the deployment is going to just surpass it. So that's number one. I think my personal opinion is that we need to ban certain classes of autonomous systems, anti-personnel systems, things like this. But I think if you have anti-material defensive systems like these close-in systems or things like that, cyber systems for defense, things like that, I think those are much more palatable. And I also think there's a special kind of space for autonomy where humans just can't go, right? That you might say, well, an unmanned sub-hunter, I'm okay with that, or something along those lines. But I think we have to have a discussion about what kinds of technologies, what kinds of targets, what kinds of rules, and then talk about norm formation from the bottom up. So not from states negotiating with that, but from militaries kind of negotiating with each other, and like NATO style, like-minded states doing like-minded things. Because I don't think you're going to see, some states will just completely ignore it regardless. So the best hope we have is this kind of norm formation about rules of engagement, particular targets, how we train, what we develop, what we don't develop, type of data sets we give them. I think those are the kinds of more nitty-gritty policy questions that can have a better impact than if I just said, I'm going to ban autonomous weapon systems, and then it's a meaningless ban because no state sign it or abide by it.
Right, and then you've got the problem, which is that the number of civilian officials above the working level who understand any of this could fit easily into this room and the available seats here. And these are very big, profound issues. And the other one is, you build an aircraft carrier today, it's your assumption that that aircraft carrier 35 years from now is going to be a functioning war system. Same with a fighter plane. With 20, 25, 30 years, you're still going to be using the same fighter plane. In this area, the one thing we know is 20 years from now, the technology around AI and autonomy and stuff is going to be unrecognizably different from what it is right now. And so that the rules that we make are going to be challenged. And government is always a lagging indicator in these areas in terms of rules formation.
Well, that's
true.
true.
It's going to get harder.
But it's true. But the Geneva Conventions are solid, right? So if you make a system that is not proportionate and is indiscriminate, it is inherently illegal. So, you violated that one. So I think we need to take solace in our existing international humanitarian law, and we need to be very mindful of that and the development of it. I think where it gets even trickier is under other international law obligations. So we have if you are a state party to Additional Protocol 1, Article 36 of that says that you are obligated to test your weapons to make sure that they are compliant with international law. So they have to go through what's called a weapons review process, or an Article 36 review. And that is to ensure that your state says, yep, this is not indiscriminate, so it's not like a poisonous gas or something like this. It is, it can be used in compliance with the laws of war. Here's the thing about this. If we start fielding systems with more and more complex AI in their targeting functions, particularly something like TRACE, which is a target recognition and adaptation in contested environments program run out of DARPA, which is using a deep neural net, using synthetic aperture radar images to do adaptive learning of new targets while deployed. How do I software check that, right? How do I do verification and validation of this software set that would be compliant with Article 36 weapons reviews? And this is something that is really, really, it's known right now. The states parties and the militaries are well aware of this, and they're trying to figure out other ways of ensuring reliability and predictability of the systems, even though they know they can't test them.
To probe it in
well,
the
there's also
Yeah.
some interesting stuff built into all of this, like just the use of the word indiscriminate, right? Because we imply that a human being acting on a battlefield is acting in a discriminating way, or that a general or an admiral acting, is acting.
Or that there's people wearing uniforms.
Or that there's somebody doing this, right? And we talk about a gas as being indiscriminate. But what if the machine is smarter than the general? What if,
I know some generals that might take issue with that.
I do too, and I also know some that I have a toaster that, well, never mind. But the point is that you could get machines that are better at discriminating than many of the other people you deploy to the battlefield. And how does that change the equation?
Yeah. I want to take some questions from the audience. We have about 10 minutes left, something like that. Sure.
So you've talked about primarily.
Oh yeah, there's a mic coming. Sorry.
Okay. You've talked primarily about state actors. Obviously, the costs of this type of thing right now are presumably prohibitive, but the point at which they become less prohibitive, what kind of work and thinking is being done about the potential threats that could come from non-state actors deploying technology that could be incredibly effective at killing a lot of people or damaging a lot of resources very quickly? Just, a drone-based attack on Walt Disney World or on the Port of Los Angeles or something like that. Where is that thought process right now?
Yeah, so I'll put my evil genius hat back on again. And here's what I can say is, we have the technology now to do that, right? I mean, I can put an explosive on a quadcopter and fly it anywhere I want. Luckily, humans generally are pretty good, and we don't do that. What I can say, though, is coming in the future, I mean, because, I can buy a Raspberry Pi for $30 and, program it to do something and put it on a quadcopter that costs $200. It's not prohibitively expensive. What I would say is that in the future, where I think it might be more worrisome is on payload and capacity, right? So you have to think about the ability for a non-state actor to have either a large swath of drones, like a large swarm of them, and then what their sizes are, and then their payload capacities to actually do significant damage. Now, the flip side of that is I don't think you're going to get super mass attacks like that, where I think you're going to see from non-state actors, right? State actors, whole different story, right? They've got resources, they can do all sorts of different things. The non-state actor, however, in terms of terrorist stuff and spectacle, right? Terrorism is about spectacle. It is about getting as much, abhorrent, shock for the action that you have. So again, you might see maybe some of that, but I don't know if you're going to see a huge amount of it because it might not have enough spectacle. But you will see, I think, more covert types of assassination. And so I think, if I have smaller systems that I can, think about the small arms proliferation that happens all over the world. That's incredibly hard to regulate because you can get a handgun, you can do all sorts of different things, and these are actually one of the reasons why we have really high fatality rates is actually the small arms. So if you have a swarm of military drones, right, that are really small, and one of them malfunctions or whatever, you can just pick it up off the battlefield, you can 3D print it, you can re-engineer it, you can do those types of things. And you can use those in more like assassination style things that are unattributable because there's no markings on it. It doesn't look like it came from the US, it doesn't look like it came from the Israelis, and then you have to start doing a who's gonna benefit from this analysis kind of thing, and attribution becomes pretty sticky. So I think that those are kind of more of the thinking that I've been doing about it, but I do think that smaller states and less democratically human rights friendly kinds of states will use these types of systems for mass oppression. So quashing of any sort of attempts at protest or anything like that. So I think that actually gives rulers an incentive for oppression in a different way than we've seen because they can kind of stand off. They don't have to, especially in things like, so think of Syria. Think if Bashar al-Assad had autonomous weapon systems to suppress his people. He doesn't even need to go then look for humans to commit atrocities in his name, right? Because that's really hard to do to your fellow citizens, is to go out and try to maim your fellow citizens. If you don't have to do that.
Kind of goes to your cost of war.
Well, and I think
worse.
basically,
Yeah.
what do we know? The cost of this is going to go down, and it will proliferate because the cost of everything has always gone down, and it has always proliferated. And once upon a time, a Stinger missile was a very special thing, and now you find shoulder-fired missiles everywhere. And I think you're exactly right to focus in terms of near-term negative consequences on the small to mid-sized state or state-ish warlords and those kind of things, actors who get some of this stuff and use it. Bashar al-Assad used barrel bombs and chlorine gas. And that's against every rule of every kind that there is, and it's really crude, and it requires
as
people
well as
to be
cluster
willing to do
munitions.
it. Yeah, and there are people, if they have the opportunity, are going to go and use these things in a variety of ways. I think another area to keep an eye on, though, which is you referred to tangentially, is the civilian use of these things or the police use of these things, and what kind of slippery slope that leads on. Because all you have to do is look at every sort of podunk town in the United States and the fact that it feels obligated to order an armored personnel carrier.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And think,
Yeah.
well, gee, what would the police force in
Ferguson
look like?
Well, I mean, but look at Dallas, right? We had an explosive ordnance disposal robot used to blow up a suspect rather than to defuse a bomb. So we have seen this
Right,
slippage.
and will you have situations where there are large, deployments of crowd-controlled drones and robots?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure, right?
And here's the thing about domestic policing. They're not bound by the Biological Chemical Weapons Convention. So you can use toxic gases in police and protest stuff where you can't use them in war.
Yeah, so think of Erdogan and the Kurds.
Yep. I think of Erdogan and just Turkey. I think it's increasingly more appropriate.
Look, did we have, sure, here or there.
Hi, my name is Janan Andrews. I'm from the United States Air Force Academy. And my question is actually, David, you mentioned that there's a lack of government officials who understand the scientific lingo, especially, I guess, in Washington. So my question is, are scientists being pushed out of Washington? And if so, is there anything that we can do to kind of promote more people who understand the technicalities before they set the public policies that involve technologies like RPAs?
Well, that question can be answered on multiple levels, right? There's a war on science. There is an active effort on the part of organized political groups to undermine scientific findings and to discredit scientists and to say facts are not really facts. That's a problem. But the bigger problem is that the qualities that we look for in elected leaders and the quality that we have sort of trained into civil servants don't include any of this stuff. They haven't been trained in it. And even the programs, they're just starting, at the Belfer Center at Harvard and some of these other, they're just starting to deal with cyber, and they're just starting to deal with autonomous weapons, and they're just starting to deal with that. And we're a long way from having, a generation of leaders who've been trained, who've worked in systems for 10 or 15 years, and who are then in a position to make a policy decision. And there's a sort of a life cycle to creating next generation leadership in this area. And I should add, and just I'm not saying this in a way that's in any way disparaging of the United States Air Force, but we're still fighting a lot of cultural barriers, right? You don't get to be the commanding generals in the United States Air Force unless you flew airplanes.
No, unless you flew fighters.
Right. And the same with commanding carrier battle groups and so forth. And yet, you know that the future of warfare is actually not going to involve human beings flying fighter planes, and it's not going to involve carrier battle groups. And so there is a cultural bias against putting people in charge who are actually trained or schooled in the areas that we need to have the background.
And who are probably nerds. I say that with all love.
No, nerds are nerds shall inherit the earth. It's in the Bible.
Yeah, right here. You got a mic coming to you. This will probably be the last one.
All right. Is there any kind of optimistic view of this where you could say, whether it's machine learning or AI or whatever, will be rules-based, and if there's kind of an agreed-upon international programming, that it's a more consistent decision-making process, and it's, you know, is there any kind of optimistic view?
I was hoping you were going to say yes. I actually wasn't sure. No?
Not at all.
Actually, my answer was going to be no. So, I mean, it was a very short answer. There's just no chance of that.
You have better faith in human frailty than the machines?
Well, that's a different question. I mean, there's rules-based stuff and people, you know, working together, especially on international levels. I sit in a room with member states, 170 member states, and I see what they do to one another, just in their little jibes in a little civilized room, right? And you go, oh, like, you know. So I'm a little less sanguine about that. But I think domestically is more my faith in humanity, right? My fellow citizens, I have more faith that they're not going to start launching drones with grenades on them at me. Whereas I think, you know, Russia or China, I'm a little less faithful that they wouldn't lob something at me. In North Korea, I really have no faith in them being nice.
Well, the thing is that there will be
That's
efforts.
kind of human-driven also, though. It's not.
Well, at the end of the day, everything is going to have a human-driven component. There are going to be efforts to try to have a rules-based approach, and they will be successful to some degree. But there will also be people in whose interest it is to have a non-rules-based approach, and who will see that it is to their benefit to have their capabilities augmented by artificial intelligence or by these other things, and they will attempt to do that. And just as there is always, you know, it's against the law to hijack an airplane and fly it into the World Trade Center. You know, didn't stop people from doing it.
I think at the end of the day, too, right, you're optimizing things' ability to kill, right? I mean, that is what they're optimizing for in this case.
I asked Jim Starvitus that actually like 3 weeks ago at the Johns Hopkins APL lab. I was like, what are we optimizing for an autonomous weapon system? And he didn't have a good answer for that one. So there's your general.
Admiral.
Admiral, that's right. That's right.
Thanks for spending your Friday afternoon with us. Thank you to our panelists.